without anyone having to actually spell it out.
By keeping its power hidden, Britain is able to claim that these jurisdictions are politically autonomous.
Independence for Cayman is not on government's agenda. That's the message being sent to the UN Special Committee on Decolonization. Attorney Steve McPhail will be representing government at the UN meeting. The committee was set up to help colonies around the world on the road to independence. But Mr. McPhail says he'll be making it clear that Cayman is not ready for that transition.
And that message is that the Premier, his cabinet, his party has no mandate from the people of the Cayman Islands to seek independence. That is the message that I will be carrying.
When the Bahamas declared independence from Britain in 1967, the offshore bankers relocated to the Cayman Islands and continued their business from there. It was the British connection that reassured bankers and their clients that their money was safe.
This British bedrock, that is what has allowed these places to become so trusted by the financial services industry and offshore finance and all these people.
In reality, much of the wealth administered in Britain's offshore havens is controlled from London.
The City of London, by and large, likes to do its really dirty work outside London. There might, heaven forbid, be a regulator who actually takes the job seriously and starts to prosecute them for fraud in London. So better to do the frauds offshore in Gibraltar or Jersey, where there's much less risk that a serious prosecution will ever happen.
Deals are often discussed and concluded in London, but then registered offshore for tax, transparency, and regulatory purposes.
What they allow the city to do is to get involved in dirty business, but then when the scandal hits, to say, well, they're kind of independent, there's nothing we can do about those places, that's not us, that's tax haven activity, and we're the city, you know, we're not involved in that kind of stuff. So it's an incredibly kind of convenient relationship.
The City of London has shaped the way in which Jersey, Guernsey, and the British Overseas Territories have developed as tax havens. I see these places as the Frankensteins created by the City of London.
Today, the UK is the world's largest provider of international financial services.
The UK has an almost unique role in global finance. If you look at data, the kind of data that we've constructed in the Financial Secrecy Index, you can see the relative shares of each country in the global provision of financial services exports. That's financial services to non-residents. Now, there are two big centres, and everything else is quite small in comparison.
The two large centres are the United States, with around 19% of the global market, and the United Kingdom and its offshore jurisdictions, which have around 25% of the global market.
And if you add to that other jurisdictions, ex-colonies, but recently independent, fairly recently, by which I mean Hong Kong, Singapore, maybe even Dubai and Bahrain, and Cyprus, then you reach a figure of nearly 40%. And I think that figure represents better the position of London in the global financial market.
The soldiers left, the administrators left all the colonies, but they still kept a significant degree of control over the financial flows from these former parts of empire and the rest of the world. So you could describe it as a second empire, Britain's second empire, sort of hidden financial empire spanning large parts of the globe.
And so many of the tax havens established in the world today, particularly in the Caribbean, were established during the slave trade, which began after the Spanish Inquisition took place under King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella in 1472. And by 1492, all the Jews in Spain were expelled, and they either fled to Portugal or hopped aboard ships and travelled to the Caribbean, where a vast Marrano Jewish community arose. And so let's have a look at that story now. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Jewish Marano money changers from Spain and Portugal had established colonies in the Caribbean under Spanish rule. On August 1st, 1492, Christopher Columbus, as we call him, set sail from Spain to escape the Spanish Inquisition. On board he had with him 5 wealthy Marano Jewish merchants as well. Their plan was to capture 500 American native slaves and bring them back to Europe, which they did, but the American natives were not very good slaves, so the Africans became preferred. Here is a monumento in Madrid showing Queen Isabella of Castile, Spain, celebrating Christopher Columbus under his real name Colon. It was Columbus's son who returned to Jamaica in 1510 with his family and began living in Jamaica and ruling the island. The Portuguese Inquisition in 1536 brought a number of Jewish families to Holland, which provided a safe haven for the Portuguese Jews. Here is a painting of Menasai ben Israel by Rembrandt, who lived in the Jewish quarter of Amsterdam, showing him with a broad hat, white trim collar and a Van Dyck beard, just like the other Dutch burghers of Dutch and Portuguese descent. In October 1655, this Kabbalistic Sephardic rabbi arrived in London at Cromwell's invitation to discuss his book, The Hope of Israel. Menasai ben Israel peppered Cromwell with the idea that England's economy would benefit from the Jews. In England, by 1654, Oliver Cromwell began advocating for the return of the Jews back into England, due to their support of him throughout the English Revolution and for the new army that the Jews in England had financed. That year, Cromwell also heard a report of Captain Jackson, an English privateer, who returned from ransacking Jamaica and submitted a report to the Colonial Affairs Committee that Jamaica was occupied by converso or Marano Jews who wanted England to protect them from the Spanish. In 1654, Cromwell summoned the Spanish ambassador and bluntly told him the British friendship with Spain was under threat so long as Spain opposed the British in the New World. By this time, Cromwell had already planned to send an armed fleet to the Caribbean. In December 1654, a fleet departed Portsmouth under the joint command of Admiral William Penn. With the fleet, he carried an army of 2,500 men under the command of General Venables. First stop was Barbados, where Venables tripled the size of his army with the beat of a drum in the public square and promised freedom, so a fifth of the population joined him. On their way to Jamaica, they stopped at Santo Domingo and made an unsuccessful attack, losing 1,000 men cut down by 300 mounted Spanish. Eventually, the British fleet reached Jamaica on May the 10th, 1655, at Cromwell's command. And over the next 15 months, Cromwell's efforts to allow the Jews back into England would be spurred on by the role of the Jews in Jamaica's conquest and the promise of their valued assistance to develop the New World Empire. Cromwell began advocating the Grand Western design, which was designed and financed by Jews, who allegedly planned to settle England and buy St. Paul's Cathedral and turn it into a synagogue. The prominent Jewish leader in London, Mr. Carvajal, was Cromwell's key advisor, and he owned many ships involved in the slave trade, and he advocated Jamaica to Cromwell. Mr. Carvajal was 46 when he arrived in London in 1635. He rode up to the city gates of London, riding a white Arabian stallion, dressed in fine armour, leading a string of pack mules carrying gold bullion. When he was halted by the King's Guard at the gates, he announced he was a merchant from the Canary Islands and had come to join his sister, who was married to the Portuguese ambassador, so he was allowed into London. Mr. Carvajal knew that Francisco Carvajal, probably his relation, lived in Jamaica and led the army there, and that he would assist the military support to a British conquest. So these two Carvajals helped Oliver Cromwell establish British rule in Jamaica. By 1658, his imports account for 8.3% of London's customs revenue. On one occasion, Carvajal's shipment was seized by custom officers, and so later he broke into the warehouse and held the guard at sword point and threatened to run him through while his servants emptied the warehouse. The police report described him as having grizzled beard and a fiery temper, and no pretense hand with the rapier, while his servant Manuel Fonseca could double his fist with any Englishman. Charges were dropped when the man called the Great Jew died later that year. In early 1655, when Cromwell announced a settlement policy for Jamaica, in the previous 5 years, Jamaica had become the burial ground for almost 3/4 of the 12,000 men, women, children and slaves who arrived there with the British. 5 years later, 1660, Port Royal was the busiest port in the New World, often visited by pirates who sold their riches cheaply to the merchant class of the Jews and Europeans together, who brought the treasures back to London and to the rest of Europe to be sold. Jamaica saw the growth of sugarcane plantations, slaves, piracy, and Port Royal rapidly grew from 1660 onwards, and the dark age of slave trading and piracy had begun. By 1663, 22 pirate captains had grand residences in Port Royal, and some even shod their horses with silver horseshoes. The most famous English pirate since Sir Francis Drake was Sir Henry Morgan. Sir Henry Morgan was a Welsh privateer who fought for the English against the Spanish in the Caribbean during the 1660s and 1670s. He is remembered as the greatest of the privateers, amassing huge fleets, attacking prominent targets and being the worst enemy of the Spanish since Sir Francis Drake. Morgan was knighted by King Charles II of England and died in Jamaica a rich man, just like Sir Francis Drake was knighted by Queen Elizabeth I. And so Port Royal was in its heyday from 1600s onwards until the 7th of June 1692, when it was destroyed by an earthquake and followed by a tsunami. And many people at the time thought it was an act of God because of the immorality and the debauchery and drunkenness that was going on in Port Royal at the time by these pirates and slave traders and merchants that were making themselves wealthy by exporting goods from this part of the world back to Europe. And likewise, people thought that Pompeii was also destroyed because of its immorality and drunkenness and debauchery in 79 AD, when Mount Vesuvius erupted and covered the city in ash. And likewise, the city of Sodom, which is a biblical city there just below Mount Masada, around about 1900 BC, was destroyed by sulfur.